for being here again. Hi everyone. Yeah, thank you if you've been to the past 3 workshops. It's good to see you again here, and welcome if this is your first workshop. Just as a reminder, make sure you're muted throughout the presentation just so it doesn't pick up the background noise. And then also, I will be answering all the questions at the end. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can just leave them in the chat box. And then if you have, or at the end of the presentation, we can unmute you and you can ask them. But the point is that we will answer them all at the end. So this is the DIY part 4 presentation. As I mentioned, we've had 3 presentations before this. And this presentation is going to focus on follow-up. So that is, what do you do after you send out your initial pitches to the media? How do you follow up with them? And then also, I like to call this part of the presentation, it's kind of just the odds and ends part of the presentation. It just has a lot of other resources and ideas that don't really fit anywhere else in the presentation. And so I kind of want to make sure I equip you with the most amount of information when you're dealing with the media. So that's kind of what this presentation is. It just kind of summarizes everything else that we've learned over the last 3 weeks. I'm not going to spend too much time introducing myself because I think a lot of you have been here for the previous 3 weeks. But as you know, my name's Rebecca, and I own a boutique PR firm here in Austin, specializing in media relations. So the only thing I do all day, every day is pitch the media. These are just kind of some of the places that my clients have been featured. And so the tips that I'm telling you are what have worked to get this type of media coverage. So as you know, if you've been here for the past 3 times, this presentation is teaching you my open method, which is the simplified and effective tips for breaking through crowded inboxes of media contacts. And so we've already gone through step 1 through 3, and then today we are on step 4, which is need to follow up. Just as a reminder, I know I've started my other presentations with this recap, but I do feel like it's important because part 1 was in September, so it was almost 2 months ago. And then, part 2 and 3 were a little bit more recent, but all of these presentations sort of build upon each other. So I think it's important to kind of spend some time recapping, just as a reminder for the people that have already been here, or for the new people, this kind of gets you up to speed. So in part 1, we talked about observing media trends. And the main goal of part 1 was to give you something to always pitch the media. Just sending out one pitch to the media is not going to be enough. It's not a good PR strategy where you're going to be consistently seeing results. So you're going to want to always look for different story ideas pertaining to you and your business. So you always have something new to pitch the media. And then at the bottom of the slide is where I listed what kind of those categories are. So you always have something to pitch the media. Part 2 is where we talked about pinpointing media contacts, where we talked about figuring out, what presentation or what media contacts you should be pitching, and how do you come up with the magazines or the outlets that you want to pitch. And just as a reminder, it's really important. So that's why I'm going to stress this again, is that you want to make sure you're really trying your best to pitch people that make sense for your brand. You don't just want to kind of pitch everyone and hope that you have a fit. Instead, you want to do your due diligence and really pitch people that somewhat make sense for your brand. One of the easiest ways to do this is look at the past stories that these media contacts have written. That way you can kind of get a sense like, okay, they cover, small businesses in my area, or okay, they cover, education. This will kind of help you to be sure that you pitch people that really make sense for you and your brand. One of the easiest ways to kind of figure out who you should be pitching, especially if you've never done this before or you don't kind of have any dream publications in mind, is to look at your competitors, see who's covered them, and pitch those same people. And then also look at kind of your industry to see if there's anyone, magazines in your industry, podcasts in your industry, that would be a good fit for you and your brand. And the way you do this is you Google your industry name and then the media outlets. So something like, marketing podcasts, education podcasts, education magazines, whatever it might be. I think that's kind of the best way to get started, especially if you don't necessarily know who to pitch or what media outlets make sense for you. So part three is what we did last week or 2 weeks ago, I believe. And this is where you actually email your contacts. So in the first section, we talked about what you're pitching, where to get your story ideas. The second part is where you built your media list, you figured out who to pitch. And then the third section is actually writing that email pitch that goes to your media contacts that you created from section one. And just to kind of stress what we learned in this section is that all your pitches should be really short and concise. All of your emails should be really short and concise because people have a short attention span. And especially some of these media contacts, the big national ones, they're getting hundreds of pitches a day. And so they're really not going to have time to read your pitch if it's really long. So you want to be able to catch their attention very quickly and concisely and give them all the information that they need right away. The next thing that we talked about over and over again in part three is your anatomy of a pitch. These are the three things that all of your emails should have in that, or all the three things that should be in all of your emails to the media. The first thing is you should state what you're offering. So in the first sentence of your pitch, you should state exactly what you're offering. So that way, if the media contact doesn't even read the rest of the pitch, they at least have some idea of what you're offering. The next thing you want to state in your pitch is your brand summary. So this is where you just summarize your brand. You kind of tell the media contact what sets you apart, what makes you different, why they should care about you. And then the next part of the pitch that you always want to make sure you have is additional information. This just provides, additional topics that you might be able to talk about, additional information about your products, additional product suggestions, whatever it might be. You want to make sure that is in bullet pointed format just so it breaks up the text. The next thing that we sort of recap or we talked about in part three is the subject line. Your subject line is really important because if you're standing out in that crowded inbox. And so if you have a good subject line and you get your pitch opened, then I truly believe you're already halfway there. You said something that caught their interest. And so what I really recommend is repeating that first sentence of the pitch in your subject line, and just kind of tweaking that and making it shorter. But that's really what makes the best subject lines. And also always remember that in your pitches or in your subject line, you should use the most recognizable information. And so that's not necessarily always your company's name. Another thing to really keep in mind, and I'm going to kind of talk about this as we go into follow-up, is you really need to pitch often. You can't just send out one pitch and hope that it lands. The goal is really to constantly be on the media's radar for when they have a fit for your story. I would say that 99% of PR is all timing. It's just that you happen to send that email when, that media contact either had a vacancy that they needed to fill, or they happen to be working on a story where your products or expertise are a fit. And so in order to kind of make timing work for you, you need to be pitching constantly. And so it's really important to stress that. So that's kind of what we talked about 2 weeks ago in part three. So now we're going to talk about step 4, which is need to follow up. And following up is important but you have to make sure that you don't annoy your media contacts. So there is a fine line between, friendly follow-up and being a little too persistent where it really turns them off to you and your brand. So why do you need to follow up? And one of the reasons that I find this section to be really important is, again, it just sets those realistic expectations that you might send out a pitch and then you might not get any responses. And then that is when you need to follow up to kind of just make sure that the media contact is either, maybe your email just fell to the bottom of their inbox and they accidentally missed it, or maybe they really aren't interested in your story at this moment. But that's why you follow up, because hopefully you'll be able to get a response back and kind of make that determination of whether or not it was just accidentally missed or they're not interested. And so I really recommend following up on every single pitch you send out, but only following up once. This way you kind of can get that answer and you know whether or not you can move on to a new pitch. So when do you follow up from when you sent out that original pitch? So I recommend just waiting a few days. Something that I like to do is I'll send out a pitch on Monday or Tuesday of the week. And then on Friday is when I like to follow up. I usually devote most of Friday to my follow up. And so I would recommend, leaving about 3 or 4 days in between the pitch because that's a good enough amount of time to know if someone is going to respond or not. You don't want to follow up like right away the next day because that doesn't give them, obviously a good amount of time to follow up. So I do recommend leaving about 3 or 4 days because you also don't want to wait too long because then at that point they're just not going to be interested or they've maybe moved on to other topics. So I do recommend, waiting about 3 or 4 days, not necessarily going beyond like a whole week. So for the follow-up, it's really, really simple. So as you can see in this example, the only thing, this is based off of an original pitch that I showed you guys in last week or 2 weeks ago in part 3. And as you can see, it's really, really simple to write your follow-up emails. All I did was change this subject line. So I, had something else before, and then I just changed the subject line to simply follow up. And then the other thing I changed in the pitch or the email is that I changed this part where I state what I'm offering to just indicate that now I'm following up on an email that I previously sent over. So other than that, those are really the only 2 changes that you need to make to your email. So as you can see, it's super easy. And the rest of the email is exactly the same. I didn't change any of this other information. So that's really all that you have to do in order to follow up via email. One thing I will mention, I don't have a slide for it, but especially for local media is really the only time that I actually do phone call follow-ups. I just find that local media, one, it's easier to find the contact information and the phone numbers for people that work, at local magazines or local TV stations or whatever it might be. And also they're a little bit more receptive to phone follow-up. National media, they're just not really, they don't really seem to want to be called. They'd rather just be emailed. And it's also, especially now that most people are working from home and they're not even at their office phone, it's a lot more effective to follow up with national media via email. Whereas local media, you can follow up via phone if you want. If you have that time and you feel like doing it. I'll do it a lot for TV stations, especially. If I send a pitch to that kind of newsroom contact email address that I showed you how to find, I guess 2 sections ago, then I'll call and say, oh, I sent you, an email about X, Y, and Z. Are you interested in covering it, or can I resend the information? So if you want to follow up via phone for local media, then definitely go ahead and do that. Okay, so what do you do if you send out your original pitch, no response, then a few days later you send out your follow-up email, still no response. Well, then what do you do? That's obviously very frustrating. And even as someone who's done this, for over 10 years, and this is all I do all day, every day, it still happens to me all the time. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. But I tell you that the more you pitch, the more likely you are to get a media placement. I'll give you an example of something that happened to me really recently to show you that it's not just you if you're not getting responses. So I was working with this client through a PR firm I worked for, and we had sent out a bunch of back to school pitches in August, and we were not getting any responses. And I think the thing was, it was just the timing was off. They didn't really fit what the media narrative was at that point. And then so we kind of like stopped for a little bit, and then now we're sending out new pitches and we're getting a ton of responses. And the reason is it was just the timing was off. And so the more you pitch, eventually the timing will be in your favor, and then you'll start to get those responses and opportunities. But here are some of my tips that I use all the time if I'm just, not getting any responses for a client that I'm working with. The first one is look for new contacts. I promise you now, with kind of all the freelancers that work at publications, and all the podcasts that are out there and all the online media outlets that are out there, you will always find someone new to pitch. Especially for me when I'm looking for podcasts to pitch, no matter how many times I do a Google search or I look for relevant podcasts, I always find more. Or, if I have sort of target publications in mind, and I go back through the publications, once a week or once every other week, I always seem to be able to find new freelancers. I was just working on something this morning before this presentation, where I had sent out all the pitches, and then I was kind of going through the publications again, and I found at least like 10 or 12 new people that I hadn't found, last week or 2 weeks ago. So always just be looking for new contacts to send that same media pitch to, because I promise you there's always more out there. Change up the story. That's where you kind of go back to what we learned in section 1 and say, okay, I just pitched a news story and I didn't get any responses. Well, let me, pitch expert advice this week, or let me pitch a product this week. So you always want to kind of be changing up the story so it seems fresh and new. That's why I really only recommend following up once for every pitch. If you're really not getting responses on that pitch, then move on to a new story idea. Come up with something slightly different so it doesn't seem like you're kind of just beating a dead horse. You've moved on to something new. So another thing you can do is just keep researching your angle. So in the second part of this presentation a few weeks ago, I talked about how you can use Google sleuthing to figure out who to pitch. And so make that a regular part of your strategy. So, for example, I think I talked about this during that presentation, but I work with a dermatologist. And so I'm always going through Google News, typing in dermatologist, and then I see who has used a dermatologist as an expert for their stories. And then from there, I always pitch that person with information about the person that I work for. And I really try to do this once a week or once every other week. And every single time I do it, I find new people who I haven't previously pitched. So you want to make sure that you're always doing that, and then you can kind of send that same pitch over and over again just to new people. And the last part of this is that you really just want to persevere. Don't give up if you don't get any responses right away, because like I've mentioned a bunch of times, is that it really is, if you just keep pitching and you keep looking for new contacts, I really, really, truly believe that eventually you will find someone who's interested in covering you and your business, and the timing works out in your favor. So I'm going to go over to the Google Drive, which is what you were sent this morning. Again, as a reminder, it has the presentation in here. Another thing that it has in here is just another follow-up example. But as a reminder, it's just all you do is change that subject line to follow up, and then change that first part of the pitch to indicate that you're now following up. So it's just another example. The other thing I have in here is a worksheet about what to do when the media is not responding. And it's based off of those 4 things that I told you in the previous slide. And the reason that I created this worksheet for you is that I know it can be really easy to want to give up. It's very frustrating when no one's responding to your pitches. And hopefully this won't be the case. Hopefully you have all the tools that you've learned throughout these last 4 weeks. So it's not the case, but it does happen. Like I said, it happens to me sometimes. And I promise you, there's nothing more frustrating, especially because I am supposed to be an expert on this topic. And so I recommend kind of writing it down what your next steps are with these 4 categories. Because again, if you come up with a game plan for, okay, this pitch didn't work, but now I'm going to pitch this, or, I sent this pitch to a wellness podcast, but I didn't really get the response I wanted. So now I'm going to look into, entrepreneurial podcasts. If you write down the game plan, then you're just more likely to do it. It helps you to kind of come up with a plan so you're not feeling overwhelmed and frustrated. So that is all that there is to step 4. So as you can see, follow-up is super easy. You don't have to recreate the wheel or anything like that. The main part of step 4 that I just want to stress is that you will probably have to do that follow-up. And again, just one time for every pitch. So now is where we come to the part of the presentation that I like to call the odds and ends part of the presentation. Again, these are just all of the things that I think are really important to stress. that don't necessarily fit into the other sections. So ultimately, the goal of PR is to be known as someone that's easy to work with. And so people come back to you over and over again without you actually having to send out pitches. If you pitch enough and if you prove yourself enough, then this really will happen. So that dermatologist I was mentioning a few minutes ago, he's the perfect example of this. I've been working with him for a few years now, and I do still send out new pitches here and there. But the reality is, he has proven to be such a good expert for the media that I don't necessarily need to pitch anymore. They just think of him right away. And so I want to kind of equip you with the things that you need to know so that you can become a resource to the media, and that people will just want to, use you over and over again for whether it's expertise, or maybe if you're a product-based brand, you get your samples there on time, you always send them the right information, whatever it might be, you're easy to work with. So they'll, come back to you over and over again. At the end of the day, just like everyone else, all these media contacts that you're going to be pitching are very strapped for time. And a lot of times, if you've proven that you're easy to work with and you can really save them time by getting them the information or whatever they need in a timely, effective manner, then you'll always be top of mind. And so that's really ultimately what you want to do and what you want to strive for as you're doing your own PR and hopefully getting these opportunities. So you send out an email pitch, and then what kind of opportunities can come your way? This is one of the things that's important to realize. And if you'll remember from last week or last time and the time before, I sort of broke the presentation down by print and online publications, and then TV and podcasts, because those are sort of the most common types of outlets that I pitch regularly. And so I sort of have done that again for this presentation, is that this first section just kind of encompasses a bunch of rules of thumb, but then I have specific sections for podcasts and TV, because preparing for those interviews is a little bit different than doing an interview for a magazine or for an online outlet. So you send out your pitch, and these are sort of, and this is for, the online or the print publications, doesn't matter if they're local or national. These are the three different things that are most common that the media is going to ask you for. So one, they'll request an email interview, and most of the clients that I work with actually prefer this. And so that's where they send over the questions for you to answer via email. One of the reasons that I personally prefer this is that you have time to kind of think through your answers. Another reason that it's preferable is that then they can just copy and paste your quote from the email. Whereas obviously, if you're doing something like a phone call, then the words aren't going to necessarily always be exactly translated into the story. So if an email interview is the opportunity that they present you, then I do kind of recommend going with this, just because you can kind of take that time to think about your answers and answer them more thoroughly. Another kind of opportunity you might come across from pitching online and print publications is a phone interview. So sometimes people will just say, oh, can we hop on the phone to go over X, Y, and Z? Or I'm working on a story about X, Y, and Z. Can you spend a few minutes talking to me? And the one nice thing about phone interviews versus email interviews is that it does, take less time to just hop on the phone with someone and just kind of talk through a topic rather than having to write something out. And then the last type of opportunity, again, if you're a product-based business, is that you might get a product request. You might get a request for a sample, depending on what your pitch was. If it was something, for holiday or gift guides or something like that, is that they might say, oh yeah, I'm interested. Can you send me a sample? So based off your email pitches, these are kind of the three most common opportunities that you'll come across. So immediately when someone sends you an email, asking for a product or wanting to set up an interview or, wanting to email you some questions, these are kind of the topics that I always ask, just to make sure I'm very clear on what the media is looking for. So first and foremost, story deadline is super important. So if they send you questions via email, you want to make sure that you get those questions answered and back to them by the time their deadline is, or else you've missed the opportunity and they're not going to include you. So ideally, if you ask for a deadline, you want to try to get them back the answers. At least I try like a day ahead if possible, just so they have those and they can ask you any follow-up questions that they might have. The same goes for product samples or product requests. You want to make sure that you ask them the deadline so you get the product there in time. And then the other thing is, if you're scheduling that phone call, you want to make sure that you're scheduling it within the time frame that they're needing that resource. Another thing that is really important to kind of ask or get more information about, especially if you're doing a phone call or they're requesting products. A lot of times for the products, they'll tell you specifically what they're interested in, so you don't really have to do any guessing game. But especially phone calls and even podcasts or TV interviews, you want to get really clear about what topics they're most interested in, because if you remember from week 3, I always recommend kind of listing 3 things that you can talk about. So I would just always recommend, when you respond back, the first thing you ask for their story deadline. The second thing you ask for is, is there anything specific that I can talk about or that you're most interested in? That way, if you're jumping on the phone or you're doing a TV interview, you kind of know right away, because sometimes they won't necessarily specify that. And so it's good for you for your preparation to make sure you ask exactly kind of what topics they're most interested in. Another thing that you always want to ask is, if they need images or additional information about your company or anything like that, that you can kind of send over to make sure right off the bat that they have everything they're looking for. And the last thing is, you really want to ask about logistics. And this really pertains more to interviews and product requests. But if you're jumping on a phone call interview, ask them like, oh, could you call me at this number? Or can I call you at your number? Make sure that they don't necessarily want to use something like Zoom or a conference call line, or whatever it might be. So you just want to kind of make sure that you're asking the more questions, the better, because you want all the details. That's how you're going to be better prepared. You're going to do a better interview if you kind of know all these details. And the more that you can kind of ask in that original email or the response back, that's better, because you can kind of get all the information right off the bat. So these are some of the things that you really want to ask before kind of jumping on a phone call or doing, a TV interview or whatever it might be. So these are the 3 things that I reiterate over and over again. So one thing that's really important is that you're constantly reiterating, if you're doing interviews, or even if you're sending products, you want to always be reiterating how you want yourself labeled or how you want the products labeled. So say, for example, you do an email interview, you answer the questions, you send them back. When you send the questions back, I always recommend including a line that says, here's my credit information. And they would include, your name, your title, and a link to your website. So you want to constantly be reiterating that, because, again, these people are really busy. They have a lot of stuff going on. They're working with a lot of different experts. So it's really up to you to always be reiterating. And same goes for products. Say, for example, you send out a holiday gift guide pitch, someone requests a sample. Well, then, a few days later, follow up to see if they got that sample. And again, reiterate, this is the product's name. This is the price. This is where you buy the product. I really can't stress enough that you can't reiterate these things enough, because I see it all the time where, people get it wrong, and it's just a pain. And I will tell you that this is a little bit of a tangent, but or off topic, but if the media does get something wrong, most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, if you just ask them nicely, they'll go back and correct it. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to correct something that's live TV or that's, in a print magazine that can't be, retracted. So that's kind of another reason online stories are nice, because it's really easy to correct any mistakes. One thing I will mention for TV is that definitely always make sure to stress your credentialing information, because that's what they'll use on the bottom lower half of your, if you're talking on the TV, there's always kind of on the bottom lower half, it says what your name is. And so you can even point that out, what you want in that information. And again, always stress anything that's important. Sometimes people will use the wrong description, or they'll call something that it's not. So always just kind of stress what's important and don't assume anything. Don't assume the media contact knows this about your business or knows this about your product. So always make sure you're kind of reiterating these things in your conversations. So now I'm going to kind of talk about some overlying do's and don'ts to interviews. And again, the point of all this is you've already done all this work to pitch. So why not make a good first impression when you're actually working with the media so they can use you over and over again? So, and or use you or your products over and over again. So here are kind of some overarching do's and don'ts to keep in mind. So there are a few different types of interviews, and it's important to kind of know this as we go into the do's and don'ts, so you can know how to prepare those things. So depending on, and these apply to kind of anytime you would talk to the person. So not necessarily an email or a product request. This would be more of a phone call or even like a podcast or a TV interview. So there's different types of interviews to keep in mind. The first one is short and quick. I always kind of hear this feedback from people sometimes is, oh, they only talked to me on the phone for, 5 minutes, or that was such a quick interview. I hope that they got all the information that they need. Again, be prepared for those short and quick encounters because they will happen. Sometimes the media contact only has those 5 minutes. And so as you do more interviews, you will sort of start to know how to talk about your brand in a concise manner. Another thing is with those types of interviews, if you felt like, oh, they didn't get something or I said something wrong, always email them after and just say, hey, I just want to make sure that I stress this point, or I just want to make sure that you capture this in your story. That's totally okay to do that. Again, it gets a little trickier with something like TV, which is a live, which can be live or pre-recorded. It depends. Another type of interview you have that I feel like kind of confuses people sometimes is an uninformed interview. It just means that the media contact doesn't know who you are, doesn't know what your business does. And you would think, oh, well, they're a journalist, they should know. But again, because they're, especially nowadays where journalists are just cranking out stories, they don't always necessarily have the time to prepare. And so I actually think that this is a great interview for you because you get to educate them on who you are. So don't be offended if they don't know. Use that opportunity to really educate them and on you and your business, and you get to control that narrative. So I actually really appreciate when someone's uninformed because then I get to kind of tell them the things that I want to tell them and really control that conversation. The other type of interview to keep in mind is that you will have long and inquisitive interviews. I do find that these are rare just because everyone is short on time, but sometimes people really have done their research and they really will ask you all of the questions. So here are some do's to keep in mind. The first one that I cannot stress enough is that one of the ways to build yourself as kind of a reliable resource and source is that you don't make up things. You say, I don't know, or I can't answer that when needed. It's really important to kind of be straightforward. If there's something that you really don't know the answer to, or it's just something that you're not able to disclose, just say that because it's a lot better than kind of trying to BS an answer. And one thing too is like if I have to talk to someone or I'm working with a client and and they don't know the answer to a question or a reporter just ask, something that you can always say is, oh, I don't know that answer to you, but I'll email you right after this call, or I'll email you later with the information. So if you're in that position, you can always just email them later when you don't know. Another thing to keep in mind when you're talking both on TV, podcast, phone interview is really make sure that you are speaking in quotable sound bites. And the way to do this is just to make sure that your answers are short and concise. You don't need to go into the weeds with your answers. Your answers should mostly be pretty high level, concise. I know when you speak, you're not necessarily thinking about sentence length, but I would really try to keep your answers within, 2 to 3 sentences. You don't want to go off rambling because then your main point can get lost. Another thing to keep in mind, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in the previous slide, is that a lot of times the journalist won't even know what your brand is or necessarily who you are. So it's always a good idea to start your interviews with a brand summary. So even if you're on a phone call with someone, you can say, oh, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about my background. Or, if you're doing a TV interview, you can always kind of slip that in there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be your whole brand summary, but just kind of a summarization of who you are and what your brand does. Here are the don'ts, and the don'ts are probably more important than the do's, definitely. So do not say anything off record. Even, and I don't really see this happen very often, or ever. I can't really remember a time that this happened, but I feel like in like the movies and on TV shows, they always have the journalist like, "Oh, tell me this off record. I won't publish it." Just don't say anything that you wouldn't want published or you wouldn't want shared. It's just not worth the risk. So, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily even have to be anything scandalous, depending on the type of company you are and the types of publications you're pitching. They might want you to disclose financials, and that's just not something that you're comfortable disclosing. So you can kind of just say, unfortunately, we can't disclose that. Don't, say it off record or anything like that. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can't just answer with yes or no questions. Of course, if that's really the only answer, that's fine, but you really want to elaborate. Yes, because X, Y, and Z. No, because X, Y, and Z. If you're talking to the media, then you're an expert on that topic. And so you need to make sure that you're giving them insight. I've actually seen this happen where it's been like pulling teeth to get from the media to get those answers. So you definitely want to make sure that you're elaborating on your answers to give them something to use in their TV segment or use in their article. This is another really big one to keep in mind and I kind of talked about this way, way back in section 1, is that the media doesn't care about promoting your brand. Unless you're paying for an advertisement, their goal is really to give their audience some information, some useful information or entertainment or whatever it might be. And so you really can't be too promotional. So you're kind of getting that publicity by being the expert or having your product included in a roundup or story. But all of your answers cannot just be about how great your brand is. Sure, you can kind of go back in your answers to specific examples that your company has done or, specific products or services from your company. But you just want to make sure that not every single answer you're giving is about how great your brand is, because then the media will never come back to you. And I've actually had this happen before. I worked with a salon chain, and the interviews were so promotional. All that they talked about, even though we were doing earned media, they were basically like advertisements as much as we tried to get them not to be. And I actually had TV stations who we booked interviews with and said, no, we're not going to have you back because these interviews are way too promotional. All you're doing is talking about your business. You're not giving the audience any useful information. So you really want to be careful that you're not doing that, because that is one of the easiest ways to make sure that someone doesn't use you as a resource again. Another thing is, don't be too negative. Try to keep it upbeat and positive. That's always kind of helpful, and it just makes it easier for the media outlets to use your information in stories. So that's kind of the do's and don'ts from a high level. Next, I want to talk about taking control of the interview, because I think sometimes when people do interviews with the media, they think that the reporter kind of has all the control and they're going to shape the story. Well, there's a few things that you can do as you're talking to the media to kind of make sure that the points you're getting across are the ones that you want to get across. So one of the easiest ways to do this is, whenever you answer a question, say how many points that you're going to have in that question. And what I mean by this is, the reporter asks, oh, tell me about this industry trend that you're seeing. Okay, well, there's 3 things that happen with this industry trend. And then that kind of gives you the opportunity to list those 3 things because you outlined it from the beginning. It also helps you to stay in control and to make sure you're not rambling, because okay, I have these 3 things I need to list. So always kind of outline that for every question that you're asked, just to help make sure you get all the points across. And then also it helps you to stay organized in your mind as you're talking. You can always bring the interview back to your main point. So, you can always say, oh, well, this is the answer to this question, but like I previously mentioned, here are X, Y, and Z, why this is important. So you can always make sure you're answering the reporter's question, but then if you want, you can kind of bring it back to your main point, or always end the answers to the questions with your main point or what you're trying to get across. Another thing you can do is simply suggest topic ideas. You can say things like, oh, well, I think your audience would be interested in this. Or, I noticed you didn't ask a question about this, but it's really important for this topic. So you can kind of make sure that by doing these three things, you're in control of the conversation and you're making sure that you're kind of inserting the points that are important to you and what you're trying to get across. Because a lot of times, depending on the length of the interview, you might not always be able to get everything across. So this is kind of a few ways to make sure that you're at least able to insert most of the information that you want. So as I mentioned before, we were kind of the way the breakdown of the course is that we started with sort of the print and online. And again, those are probably the most common types of interviews that you're going to do. And then we're going to go into podcasts because especially if you're doing your own media outreach, I feel like podcasts are just such a good target for you because there are so many of them that no matter what industry you're in, you could definitely pitch podcasts. So here are some ways to prepare for your podcast interview. One, try to at least listen to a few previous podcasts. And the reason for this is because you want to know the format of the show. You want to know if there's always one question that the guest asks during the show or whatever it might be. You want to know the style. Is it super conversational? Is it a little bit more, serious, whatever it might be. So I definitely recommend listening to a few episodes before you are on with them. Have your notes in front of you. The nice thing about podcasts is that it's usually only audio. So you can definitely always have your notes in front of you and you can make sure that you're kind of answering accordingly. One thing I will mention is that I sort of have, this is a little bit off topic, but I sort of have mixed feelings about this. Depending on the type of interview, sometimes the reporter or the podcast host will send over the questions ahead of time, which is obviously ideal. But not all of them will do that. And so it's always fair game to ask them once, like, oh, do you mind sending me over the questions? Or do you mind letting me know what topics, you're most interested in? But if they say no, don't badger them about it. So it really depends on the outlet because some people are really against it. Some people don't mind, etc. And always make sure you're practicing. The things that you should be really practicing are your brand summary, because you're going to say that over and over again, and then any really important points that you're going to say over and over again as you do interviews. So those are kind of the things for podcasts. Another reason that I really think podcasts are great if you're doing your own media is that there's just not as much pressure because one, they're rarely live. Most people record a bunch of episodes and then we'll publish them over a certain amount of time. Another thing is they're only audio, so you're kind of in the comfort of your own home just without anyone seeing you. So it's just a lot less pressure than something like TV. All right, now let's talk about TV. I definitely feel like out of all the different types of interviews, obviously TV can be the most nerve-wracking, especially if it's live TV. And so that's something else to ask people when you're booking that interview. When they say, yes, I'm interested in talking to you, are you available on this date? You should always ask them, will this be live or pre-recorded? So then that way, I don't know necessarily if it would make a lot of difference, but it's good to know. Obviously if it's pre-recorded, they can go edit later. Live can be a little bit more nerve-wracking, but the more you do, the more you'll just be amazing at live TV. So the thing with TV is usually the interviews are very, very short. You usually have about 3 to 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. And so you want to make sure that you can really talk about your brand in a concise manner. Those minutes go by super fast, especially when you're on TV. So you want to make sure, again, that you have some type of outline about what the points you want to talk about are. And then also make sure that you really can talk about your brand in that concise manner with your brand summary. So I did want to really mention how-to segments because depending on what kind of business you have, DIY or how-to segments are usually very popular on TV. And obviously in anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, you're not going to be able to go through a whole segment about how to cook something or how to do this craft project. And so you really want to be able to cut corners. And here's the best way to do that. is make sure you have all your supplies ready. Anything that you need, make sure it's ready to go. Reduce your steps. So, for example, you're not going to do every single thing that you would use to make a sauce. Like, let's say, for example, you're making a chicken recipe and there is a homemade sauce in it. So you would have the sauce already prepared, but then you would maybe show yourself pouring the sauce on the chicken. Or you would have, your vegetables chopped. Or if you're doing a craft project, you would have kind of everything right there. So you want to make sure that you're reducing your steps. And so you're only really doing kind of those crucial, important steps to kind of give people an idea of how to do this. Make sure you definitely have your finished product ready to show. So you would have sort of all the steps, but then you would also have that finished product. And the reason for that is obviously, again, you're not going to be able to walk through the entire segment. All the steps during that short segment. So you want to make sure that you have something at the end that you can say, look, and once you do all of this, here's what it looks like. Especially for any type of how-to segments, I would really recommend doing a run through at home. You can watch other segments on the TV station's website, or just in general, look for kind of these other how-to segments to see how they do it. But I would really recommend doing a run through at home so you can kind of know, like, okay, I need to grab this at this point, or I need to mix this at this point. And again, these aren't just food segments. I think for, how-to segments, those are the most common. A lot of them have to do with crafts or stuff like that. Anything that you can show how to. And again, the visuals do really well on TV. Okay, 1 second before I go to that next slide. I did want to show you in the Google Drive, I have a document for prepping for TV interviews. Again, because the goal is, because these interviews are so short, you need to make sure that you've mastered your messaging. And so this is one of the easiest ways to do this, is to answer these questions so you can kind of know, okay, well, if they ask me my personal story, here's what I say. Here are some stats about why my business is awesome. Here is information about my audience, so I know who I'm talking to. So if you kind of answer these questions ahead of time, it will help you as you're going into TV, because you already know the answers to them and you've already figured out a concise way to answer them. So those are kind of the ins and outs of TV. One other thing that I would say for TV is make sure, depending, again, nowadays, a lot of times the segments are done through Zoom, like everything else in the world. So this is kind of nice in some ways, because you can be at home, you don't have to go to the studio, stuff like that. You can just do it via Zoom or via Skype, similar to what we're doing here. But if you do happen to go into the studio, you just want to make sure you're not super fidgety, you're not fidgeting with your clothes. One other point that I would mention is, don't use TV as an opportunity to try out a new outfit. Again, it's a little bit different nowadays with Zoom, because you're only going to be, your neck down. But you don't want to go into a TV interview where you're wearing a new shirt and you don't really know how it fits, or you're wearing a new skirt that you just don't feel comfortable with. You want to make sure you're wearing things that you feel very comfortable in, so then that way you're not just playing around with them the whole time or fixing it as you're on the segment and stuff like that. So I always recommend, don't wear anything new to TV that you don't know if you feel 100% great in. Another thing to keep in mind with TV is always wear like a bold color shirt or something. Even if you're doing a Zoom interview, I think it's always nice to kind of have a bold, bright color with not too many patterns, because that usually looks the best on TV segments. So now let's talk about a few other things that are really important as you go on your PR journey. So press releases. I always get asked this question, not only when I'm doing these DIY presentations, but honestly, when I'm working with clients or, talking to people, and people are always like, well, what do I need a press release? And my answer is yes and no. You definitely don't need a press release for every single thing. I find that a lot of times people will just create a press release because they think, okay, I'm doing PR, so I need a press release. And honestly, they take a lot of time. And so you rarely actually need them. The only time I think they're useful is when you are talking or sharing something new. So a new location, a new service, a partnership, anything that's kind of new that has a lot of information. The reason is because press releases, they kind of summarize that information in one spot. So if someone's interested in doing a story, then they can just have all the information right there. Another reason that if you're announcing something new, press releases are useful is because sometimes people really will just post them as is, which is kind of ideal. I was just doing a new partnership and we had a press release and people, would just post the press release as is. And it's awesome because in that way there's no room for error. It's your press release. So anytime you kind of release those new news ideas, I would recommend doing a press release, but you definitely do not need a press release all the time. And again, it's only if it's something with a lot of information that you want to make sure people are kind of keeping straight. So I have an example of a press release pulled up here so we can kind of go through it. If you Google, this is kind of one of the ones that I found. Now, of course, I can't find it. Oh, sorry, I think it's up here. But this one was kind of the style that I write my press releases in, so I wanted to use it as an example. But if you just Google press release examples, you will find a ton of images of them, and you can kind of pick and choose what fits best for you. You don't necessarily have to follow this format. Again, it's really just making sure that you have all the information on the page. So that's what I really recommend doing is kind of Googling and seeing all the different styles to make sure that you find something that's a fit for you. So this is like the basic format of press release and probably the easiest is you always want to have your contact information or whoever the media should reach out to up here in the left corner. You always also want to make sure you have for immediate release written somewhere on it. This is so the media knows that if you're sending this, they can share the news right away. There's not a certain date that they have to wait for or anything like that. Then you have your subject line. You have, your main, not your subject line, yeah, your subject line or title line. You have the main one right here, which kind of summarizes the whole press release. And then I always just do like a subtitle, which is just another sentence explanation of what the press release pertains to. So I was always taught in school and that you make your press releases an upside down triangle. So the most important information is at the top, and then it kind of goes down to like the details that maybe aren't the most interesting information. And so you always want to make sure that your first sentence of your press release kind of contains the who, what, when, where, the basic details, the most important things. Again, it goes back to that idea that if someone doesn't read the whole press release, they at least get the gist from that first paragraph. Another thing I want to mention is that press releases, they usually do use quotes. It's usually a quote from the business owner, or if it's a partnership, it would be the quotes from both business owners. And the purpose of the quote should just be, why is this important? What significance does this have? Is the company excited about it? And then press releases always end with this on the bottom, which is called a boilerplate. And it's your brand summary. It's just the information about your business, what you do, who you are, all of that stuff. And so this is really all there is to a press release. It's nothing too crazy. Again, it's just really important to kind of have all those details in one place for the media to either reference or if they just want to post it as is, which would be awesome for you. The other type of kind of collateral that I want to talk about is a media advisory, which is another document that us publicists like to send the media for different occasions or events. Media advisories are always for events. And the reason that I bring this up here is that if you are doing any types of events, either virtual or in person, I do think media advisories are useful because, again, it puts all that information in one spot. You put the time that people need to be at, the location, all of that stuff. It's put in one spot that you can just send the media, and then every time they need to go back to it, they can kind of reference it and they have everything in one place rather than, in a bunch of emails. So here's an example of what a media advisory looks like. This is kind of how I usually send mine, is that you have the what, who, when, where, why. And that's really all it is to it. It's like, what is this event? Who's putting on this event? When's it happening? Where is it happening? And then kind of the why is any additional information that you might find useful or that you think would convince the media to cover it. And then you can kind of put a link to a Facebook event if it's an event, if you have one for the event, or your website or whatever it might be. But again, I do think it's really important to kind of send this type of format if you're sending information about an event, because it's just a really quick reference that the media can look at and then know all the details of the event. If you are sending a press release or a media advisory in your email, all I recommend doing is, kind of going back to last week, part 3 about writing pitches, is that you would put a few sentences, I'm sending you more information about this event. This is what the event is. Please see the media advisory below for all the details. Or, I'm sending you information about this new brand collaboration, 1 or 2 sentences, and then you can say, please reference the press release below. So if you are sending a media advisory or press release, you don't really have to make your pitch super long. You can just kind of summarize it really quickly and then say, please see below. And I do always recommend, I mentioned this before, is that you never really want to send attachments on your initial pitch. You always want to just send your initial pitch as one email. And so I always recommend copying and pasting the press release below your signature, or copying and pasting the full media advisory below your signature. That way your email just doesn't get caught up in spam filters and everyone can have it right away. So that's kind of the 2 main documents that you need to do PR on your own, or a press release and a media advisory. One other thing that I quickly want to talk about is contributed articles, for 2 reasons. So the first reason is sometimes you'll send someone a pitch and this happens to me all the time, and they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have time to do an interview. Would you be interested in writing an article? And the reality is, it goes back to the fact that a lot of these journalists, they're cranking out content all the time. They just need the content. So you could just write the whole article yourself. Another thing is, you might actually just pitch contributed articles. If you do a quick Google search, something along the lines of websites that accept contributed articles, or websites that accept contributors, you can find a lot of lists of websites that you could become a contributor to. And so contributed articles, I would say they're a little tricky because they do take extra time. It takes time to write an article. And a lot of the websites, depending on how big they are, they might want an exclusive. So that means that you can't post it to your blog, or you can't post it on another website. That being said, always ask, because as soon as someone comes back to you and says, yes, we're interested in having you write a contributed article, always ask, oh, well, do you want this to be an exclusive? What are your guidelines? What is your word count? Stuff like that. But if they say that they don't want it to be an exclusive, then you can pitch it to other places too. So you kind of get the most bang for your buck, because you place the article in one outlet, but then it gets posted in other outlets as well. So I think contributed articles, because they do take a lot of time, they are, a little bit harder to write. But at the same time, you get to control the whole message. So as if you do a phone call interview, or you do an interview on a TV station, you really only get those few sentences. Where if you do a contributed article, you control the message. You're writing this whole article based on your knowledge. So I feel like it is really beneficial in that way. And I'll tell you, so I don't do it anymore just because it took too much time. But I used to be a contributor for Entrepreneur and Fast Company and all these places. And this was years ago. This was like in 2013 or 2014. I still get people emailing me off those articles. And that was like, 7 years ago. Huffington Post was another place that I used to contribute. And so, yeah, it is worthwhile. I will say, for me personally, it's something that I do somewhat wish I never gave up, because I was seeing a lot of benefits from it, and something that I've been considering starting again. So I definitely think it's worth it. I think it's also worth it that if this is the route you want to go in, have a really good copywriter available that can write the articles for you. I have one who I love, and it just makes it so much easier. If you're not a writer, or you'll put it off forever, hire someone to write it for you. But give them the information so it feels authentic to you. So here are just some kind of general things to think about when you're writing a contributed article. They usually are around 500 to 700 words, but always confirm with the media contact. Ask them what the word count is. Again, it can't be too promotional. The whole article just can't be information about how great your business is. Make sure it's in digestible nuggets of information. And the easiest way to do this is put your articles in listicle form. And what I mean by this is, They should be categorized as, 5 ways to do this, 3 ways that this makes your life easier. And then you can kind of list those 3 ways with a little bit of explanation under each. That's usually the way that the publications want them. And it also helps you to write the article because that way you make sure you're not just kind of rambling on and on. So that's kind of about contributed articles. Again, I do think that if you're interested in this, you should just Google some lists. You should just Google, publications that accept contributors, stuff like that, because there are a lot of really good lists out there, and you can just pitch those people and mention to them that you want to write a contributed article. So now what? Okay, so you did all this stuff, you aced your interview, you have, the article or you have the link to the story. So what do you do with it? You want to make sure that you're kind of giving it the most bang for your buck. And so the first thing that you want to do, especially as you start to accumulate articles or accumulate stories about yourself, is you want to make sure you have a press page on your website. Because I've mentioned this in the past in in the earlier workshops, PR is great for getting new eyes on your business, but it's also great for people who are unsure if they want to buy from you. So anytime someone visits your website and they see your press page, that automatically gives you credentialing in their mind. Oh, wow, this person's been on Forbes, they must be legitimate. Or, wow, this person has been on Entrepreneur Magazine, then I should trust them. So putting a press page up is really, really important. Another thing that you really want to make sure you're doing is making sure that you're sharing your articles on social media, in your newsletter, stuff like that. You want to make sure it just gives you more content to kind of share on these other outlets. And again, it goes back to that credentialing. As people are watching you on social media or people who are on your newsletter, they start to see these placements, then it just kind of goes to show them like, oh, I really should hire this person because they've been in this publication, or oh, I really should buy this product because they've been on this blog that I really like. So those are the kind of the 2 easiest ways to make sure that you're really getting kind of that bang for your buck and you're doing more with the article than just kind of getting it. You're actually letting people know that you're in these publications. So I want to talk, this is kind of the last slide, and I always include this in my DIY PR workshops because, there are some things to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, if you ultimately are in a position to hire a PR firm, one of the main reasons I think that people should hire a PR firm is because it kind of provides that buffer between you and the media. And so if you're doing your own PR, you have to kind of keep in mind that there is a game here and you can't really be too overly important or pushy. You have to just, not follow up with people too many times. You also have to make sure that if someone says no, you don't get upset, anything like that, because at the end of the day, they might just be saying, no, they don't have a fit right now, but in a month or in a week, they might have a fit for you and your brand. So you want to make sure that you're just being really nice and, accommodating, because again, you want to make that good first impression and you want to build those relationships. And this is how you kind of do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that PR is really a marathon and not a sprint. That's why I really recommend pitching all the time. At least once or twice a month. If you can, spending about 30 minutes to an hour on it a week, because it is going to take time to not only accumulate those placements, but also for just placements to come out. Sometimes it takes weeks, if not more, for a placement to actually come out. So the more that you're pitching, the more you'll start seeing those placements regularly. Another thing that's really, really important is jump when a reporter says jump. And what I mean by this is don't reschedule interviews 5 times. If they ask for images, get them in a timely manner. If they ask for samples, get the samples in a timely manner. If they want to do a phone call with you, make sure that you're responding in a timely manner with some times that you're available. Whatever it is, you really want to make sure that you're being responsive and getting people the things that they need when they need them. Because if you don't, they're just going to move on to another brand. They're going to call another expert. They're going to fill that story with other products. And so you just really want to make sure that you're not making reporters run through hoops, because then they're never going to work with you again. And then you're not even going to get the placement to begin with. So those are the 3 things that I really recommend that you keep in mind as you're doing your own PR and as you're interacting with the media. because ultimately at the end of the day, you want to build the relationships with these people so they keep covering you over and over again. So that really concludes the fourth part of this presentation. As most of you probably know, this is how you can get in contact with me. Feel free to always email me with more questions or anything like that. I'll obviously stay on now for a few minutes to answer any of those questions. And then there's my website at the top. And I usually do try to share blog posts with more PR tips and kind of more information on specific topics about how to do your own PR. So that's all I have for part 4. Now I will take any questions either through the chat or I believe we can unmute you.
Thank you, Rebecca. If anybody has any questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. I just want to let you know that in the chat box, I have included the link to complete our Brainstorm. If you have a moment, go ahead and a couple of that we have coming up next. If you are in commercial real estate, we have questions surrounding COVID. We have a 4-part series coming up that's going to cover all that. I'm going to drop our link so that you can register for that if that is something of interest to you. And then also, because the holidays are coming up, we have a few workshops that are specifically geared towards marketing through Instagram. And then if your website is e-commerce ready, again, follow the link. That information will be there for you to register. Let's see. Do we have any questions before we end this meeting? Rebecca, do you have anything else?
No, I mean, that's it. Thank you so much for being here with me the last 4 sessions. And again, if you have any questions, I mean, the other thing I can answer is any questions you might have from the previous sections. But again, always feel free to email me. You know, as you're kind of implementing all these things, you might come up with a question or might have something specific to your brand. So don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, perfect. And I will follow up with an email and I'll include Rebecca's contact information in there. Again, if you maybe missed a part, you know, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send you the YouTube link to this. Okay. Again, Rebecca, we appreciate you so much for participating in this and actually presenting this to small business clients in the Austin local area. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. I'll talk to you all later.
Bye.
Bye.